Hey, my name's Adam, I'm 34, and I live in Boston. I work as a graphic designer for a marketing agency. Steady job, decent hours, and a life that, until recently, I thought was pretty solid. That I met my wife, Jenna, about 7 years ago at a friend's wedding. She was the maid of honor, and I was one of the groomsmen. We clicked instantly. She had this sharp wit, a sense of humor that could cut through any awkward silence, and this confidence that was just magnetic. She worked as a paralegal at a law firm downtown, and she always talked about wanting to go to law school one day. We dated for 2 years before getting married. Things were good, really good for the first few years. We traveled, hosted game nights with friends, and spent lazy Sundays binge-watching shows. We even started talking about buying a house and maybe having kids in a couple of years, but about a year ago, things started to change. Jenna became distant, distracted. She'd come home late from work, claiming she had to stay late to help one of the attorneys with a case. At first, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But then it started happening more often. She'd be glued to her phone, texting constantly, and if I asked who it was, she'd brush it off like it was nothing. That it wasn't just the late nights, though. She started picking fights over the smallest things, like the way I loaded the dishwasher or what show we were watching. It felt like she was looking for reasons to be mad at me. I tried to chalk it up to stress from work, maybe even the pandemic throwing things off, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That I never wanted to be the suspicious husband. I trusted Jenna. But trust can only stretch so far before it starts to snap. And let me tell you, when it snapped hard. The day everything unraveled started like any other. It was a Saturday morning, and Kelly had mentioned the night before that she needed to run some errands, her favorite new excuse for disappearing for hours. I was working on a project deadline, so I figured it would be a quiet day with Max at my feet and some music playing in the background. But as I sat at my desk, something didn't sit right. It felt like there was a storm brewing, and I was about to get caught right in the middle of it. Around noon, I noticed Max pacing by the door, whining softly. That was strange. Max loved his walks, but he was usually calm when he knew Kelly was out. I decided to take him out to clear my head. As we walked past our neighbor's house, Mark's place, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Kelly's car was parked in Mark's driveway. At first, I thought maybe she'd just stopped by to drop something off. We were friendly with Mark and his wife, Rachel, after all. But then I saw the curtains in Mark's living room shift, like someone was peeking out. My heart started pounding. What were the odds that she just happened to be there for something innocent? I stood there for a minute, my mind racing. I knew I could have walked away, pretended I didn't see anything. But that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me. So, I tied Max's leash to the fence, took a deep breath, and walked up to Mark's front door. I knocked once. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. But then, just as I was about to walk away, I heard voices inside her voice. Laughing. Relaxed. The kind of laugh she hadn't shared with me in months. That was all the confirmation I needed. I pounded on the door, my anger boiling over. Finally, the door cracked open, and there she was, Kelly, looking completely shocked, like I was the one intruding on her day. Dan? What are you doing here? I stared at her, struggling to keep my voice steady. I should be asking you that. Before she could answer, Mark appeared behind her, his face pale and guilty. That was it. All the pieces clicked into place, and I realized the truth I'd been trying to ignore was staring me right in the face. Unbelievable, I muttered, turning on my heel and walking back to Max, who was still waiting patiently by the fence. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, but I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. I don't even remember the walk back home. My mind was a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak, all crashing into each other at once. How do you process the fact that the person you trusted most betrayed you with someone who lived next door? It wasn't like she had an affair with some stranger I'd never meet. It was Mark, the guy I shared beers with during backyard BBQs, the guy who borrowed my lawn mower last summer. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door behind me so hard that Max flinched. I sat down on the couch, staring at the floor, trying to steady my breathing. I needed answers. I needed to know how long this had been going on, why she did it, and most importantly why she thought I wouldn't find out, but before I could even start to piece together my thoughts, I heard the front door open. She had the audacity to come home like nothing had happened, that I didn't even give her the chance to settle in. So, how was Mark's house? I shot out, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it before. She froze in the doorway, her face going from surprise to defensive in a heartbeat. Dan, it's not what you think. I laughed a bitter, hollow laugh. Oh, really? Because from where I was standing, it looked exactly like what I think. She dropped her bag on the floor and crossed her arms. You're overreacting. Overreacting? I stood up, feeling the heat rise in my chest. You're cheating on me with our neighbor, and I'm overreacting? Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, I saw a flash of the woman I didn't recognize anymore, the one who'd been snapping at me, lying to me, laughing behind my back. I'm not having this conversation with you if you're going to be dramatic. That was it. She was caught red-handed, and somehow, I was the problem. No, Kelly. We are having this conversation. Right now. I stepped closer, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. How long has this been going on? She hesitated, and that hesitation was all I needed to know it wasn't some one-time mistake. It was deliberate. It was planned. It was ongoing. A few months, she finally muttered, looking anywhere but at me. A few months, I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. So, all those errands, all those late nights, that was you sneaking off to Mark's house? She didn't answer, and the silence was louder than any excuse she could have made. That I shook my head, trying to wrap my mind around it. Why, Kelly? What did I do to deserve this? She finally met my eyes, and instead of guilt, there was this coldness, like she was bored of the conversation. I don't know, Dan. Maybe I just needed something different. You've been so predictable. Predictable. That word echoed in my head like a punch to the gut. I'd spent years building a life with her, trusting her, supporting her, and now I was being tossed aside like yesterday's news because I wasn't exciting enough. Wow, I whispered, shaking my head. You know what, Kelly? I hope Mark was worth it. Because you just threw away everything we built for a fling with the guy next door. She rolled her eyes, like I was being inconvenient by having emotions about her betrayal. Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's not like we were perfect. I felt something inside me snap, not out of anger, but out of clarity. This wasn't the woman I married. The woman I married wouldn't have lied, cheated, and then gaslight me when confronted. You're right, I said quietly. We weren't perfect. But at least I was honest. I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked upstairs, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing. She followed me, her voice rising in frustration. What are you doing? I didn't even look at her. What does it look like? I'm leaving. You're overreacting, Dan. We can talk about this. I spun around, cutting her off. No, you don't get to decide how I react. You made your choice, Kelly. Now I'm making mine. I finished packing, grabbed Max's leash, and walked out the door without looking back. The woman standing in that house wasn't my wife anymore. She was just a stranger wearing her face. That I drove to a friend's place that night, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the sheer audacity of her trying to pin it on me, it was all too much. But somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, there was a small, quiet voice inside me that said, "You're better off without her." The first night away from home felt surreal. I was crashing on my friend Jake's couch, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the last few hours in my head. It was like living through a bad dream, except I couldn't wake up. The woman I'd built a life with, shared every secret and every plan for the future with, had been sneaking around with Mark, the guy whose house I could see from my kitchen window. That I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the indifference in her eyes, the dismissiveness in her voice when she told me I was being dramatic. She wasn't even sorry. That was what stung the most. It wasn't just the cheating, it was the complete lack of remorse. The next morning, Jake offered to take me out for breakfast, but I wasn't in the mood to pretend everything was normal. Instead, I sat on his balcony with a cup of coffee, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. The house, the dog, the life we'd built together, it all felt like it belonged to someone else now. By noon, my phone started buzzing. It was Kelly. First, a text, "Can we talk?" Then another, "I think we should figure things out like adults." And finally, "You're being ridiculous. We need to discuss this." Ridiculous. That word sent a wave of anger through me. She cheats, lies, and somehow I'm the one being ridiculous? I didn't respond. I wasn't ready. But I knew I couldn't avoid her forever. We had shared responsibilities, a shared life, and as much as I wanted to disappear and never deal with her again, that wasn't realistic. Later that day, I decided it was time to confront her properly, not just about the affair, but about everything. I needed closure, and as much as I hated it, that meant facing her one last time. I texted her back, "I'll be by tomorrow to get the rest of my stuff. We'll talk then." Her reply was immediate, "Fine." The next day, I drove back to the house. Pulling into the driveway felt like stepping into enemy territory. This wasn't home anymore. It was just a building filled with broken promises and lies. I walked in, and there she was, sitting on the couch like nothing had happened. She didn't even bother to stand up. "So," she said, her tone flat. "You're really doing this?" I dropped my bag by the door and crossed my arms. "You really think there's something left to fix?" She sighed dramatically, like this whole situation was just an inconvenience for her. "I made a mistake, Dan. But you're acting like it's the end of the world." I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. "A mistake? Kelly, you didn't accidentally spill coffee on the carpet. You cheated on me for months with our neighbor. That's not a mistake, that's a choice." She shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." That hit me harder than I expected. Boring. The same word she'd thrown at me during our argument. I'd always thought we had a solid relationship, built on trust and shared values. But apparently, that wasn't enough for her. She wanted excitement, and when she didn't find it in me, she went looking next door. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath the surface. "If boring means being loyal and honest, then yeah, I'm boring. But at least I can look in the mirror and respect the person staring back." She didn't say anything after that. Just sat there, arms crossed, like she was waiting for me to storm out. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. I calmly packed the rest of my things, grabbed Max's leash, and stood by the door. "This is the last time you'll hear from me," I said quietly. "I'm done." And with that, I walked out, leaving behind the woman who had shattered my trust and the life we'd built together. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: whatever came next, it would be on my terms. Leaving that house for the last time felt like walking away from a crime scene. Everything inside those walls was tainted, every memory, every laugh, every late-night conversation. It was all a lie, or at least that's how it felt in that moment. The life I thought we'd built together had crumbled, and I was left standing in the rubble, trying to figure out how to breathe again. I drove around aimlessly for a while, not ready to head back to Jake's place, not ready to sit still with my thoughts. Max was in the back seat, his head resting on the window, oblivious to the emotional hurricane swirling inside me. I envied him in that moment. How simple life must be when your biggest worry is when you'll get your next walk. Eventually, I parked at a nearby overlook, one of those spots where you can see the whole city stretch out below you. I sat there for hours, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the city lights flickering to life one by one. It was strange out there, life was moving on, people were going about their business, completely unaware that my world had just collapsed. That night, as I lay on Jake's couch, staring at the ceiling again, the reality of it all finally hit me. I wasn't just dealing with a broken heart, I was dealing with the loss of an entire future I'd imagined. The trips we'd planned, the family we talked about starting, the growing old together on our front porch, it was all gone. Just like that. Over the next few days, I moved through life like a ghost. I went to work, but I wasn't really there. I'd stare at my computer screen, pretending to focus, but my mind kept replaying every conversation, every missed sign. How had I been so blind? How long had she been pulling away before I even noticed? And Mark. That betrayal cut just as deep. He wasn't just a neighbor, he was someone I trusted, someone who'd shared beers in my backyard, swapped stories about work, even joked about how we were all lucky to have great spouses. The irony wasn't lost on me. One evening, about a week after I left, I got a message from Rachel, Mark's wife. I hadn't even thought about what this meant for her. She was caught in this mess just like I was. "Hey Dan, I'm so sorry for everything. I had no idea. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a while, unsure how to respond. What could I even say? We were both casualties of their selfishness, but talking about it wouldn't change what happened. Still, part of me felt like I owed her some kind of acknowledgement. "Yeah, I'm around. Let me know when." We met at a small coffee shop the next day. Rachel looked just as wrecked as I felt, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back in a messy bun like she hadn't slept in days. We sat down, both of us awkwardly stirring our drinks before either of us spoke. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have seen it. I feel so stupid." I shook my head. "Don't. If anyone knows how easy it is to miss the signs, it's me." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared betrayal settling between us like a thick fog. Eventually, we started swapping stories, piecing together the timeline of their affair. It was almost surreal, like solving a puzzle where the picture is your own heartbreak. Turns out, it had been going on for longer than I thought. Months, maybe even a year. They'd been sneaking around right under our noses, using their friendly neighbor routine as a cover. The worst part? There were times we'd all been together, barbecues, neighborhood gatherings, even double dates, and they were carrying on their little secret right in front of us. By the time we finished our drinks, I felt an odd sense of relief. Talking to Rachel didn't fix anything, but it made me realize I wasn't alone in this. We were both victims of the same betrayal, and somehow, sharing that burden made it a little easier to carry. After that, I decided it was time to start reclaiming my life. I couldn't let Kelly and Mark's betrayal define me. I started looking for a new place, somewhere far from that neighborhood and all its memories. I found a small apartment downtown, nothing fancy, but it felt like a fresh start. A place that was entirely mine, untouched by lies and broken promises. Moving in was bittersweet. I unpacked my things, but with every box I opened, there were reminders of the life I'd left behind. Photos from trips, gifts from anniversaries, little notes we used to leave each other around the house. I boxed them all up and shoved them into the back of a closet. I wasn't ready to deal with them yet, but I knew I couldn't throw them away either. Not yet. Life slowly started to settle into a new routine. I went to work, took Max for long walks in the city, and even started picking up old hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage. Photography, hiking, reading books that weren't just lying around the house for decoration. It felt good to rediscover parts of myself I'd forgotten, but even with all the progress, there were still moments when the weight of it all would sneak up on me. A random song on the radio, a familiar scent, a couple holding hands on the street, it all had the power to pull me back into that dark place. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, and with each passing day, I felt a little lighter. One evening, about 3 months after everything fell apart, I found myself standing on my apartment balcony, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, I felt okay. Not great, not ecstatic, but okay. And after everything, that felt like a victory. I realized that healing isn't about waking up one day and feeling 100% better. It's about the small victories, the days when you don't think about them, the moments when you laugh without feeling guilty, the times when you look in the mirror and recognize yourself again. And as I stood there, breathing in the cool night air, I knew one thing for sure: I was going to be okay. A few months into my new routine, life started to feel normal. Not the same kind of normal I had with Kelly, but a new, quieter version. It wasn't filled with constant companionship or shared routines, but it was mine, and that felt like progress. I had my own space, my own rhythm, and Max was always by my side, grounding me in ways I didn't know I needed. But healing isn't a straight line. Just when you think you've moved past something, it sneaks up and slaps you in the face when you least expect it. It was a Friday evening, and I'd just gotten back from a long week at work. I poured myself a drink, sat on the couch, and flipped through the channels, trying to unwind. That's when my phone buzzed. Kelly. Seeing her name pop up after months of silence felt like someone had punched me in the gut. I stared at the screen, debating whether to ignore it or throw the phone across the room. But curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I opened the message. "Hey Dan, I know it's been a while, but I just wanted to check in. I've been thinking about you a lot. Can we talk?" I blinked at the screen, my mind racing. Talk? After everything she'd done? What could she possibly have to say now that would change anything? I sat there for a while, my drink untouched, staring at her message. Part of me wanted to reply with something cutting, something that would make her feel even a fraction of the hurt she'd caused me. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger in the past few months, knew better. So, I didn't reply. I turned off my phone, grabbed Max's leash, and went for a walk instead. The cool evening air helped clear my head, and by the time I got back, I felt lighter. I realized something important on that walk: her reaching out didn't have to mean anything unless I let it. But, of course, life wasn't done testing me. A week later, I ran into Mark at a grocery store downtown. Yeah, the same Mark who had been sneaking around with my wife behind my back. He looked just as surprised to see me as I was to see him. For a second, we both froze, like deer caught in headlights. But then, he had the nerve to walk up to me, as if we were just old friends who'd lost touch. "Dan," he said, trying to sound casual, like he wasn't the reason my marriage had imploded. "Man, it's been a while." I stared at him, disbelief and rage simmering just below the surface. This guy, this snake, thought we could just pick up where we left off. "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, my voice low and steady. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing around nervously. "Look, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Things with Kelly didn't exactly work out like I thought they would." I almost laughed. Of course, they didn't work out. Relationships built on betrayal usually don't. But hearing him admit it out loud? That hit different. "Well," I said, narrowing my eyes, "I hope it was worth it." He opened his mouth to say something else, but I didn't give him the chance. I grabbed my groceries, turned on my heel, and walked out, leaving him standing there like the fool he was. That encounter stuck with me for days. Not because I still cared about Kelly or Mark, but because it reminded me of how far I'd come. The old me would have let that conversation spiral in my head for weeks, replaying every word, every look. But this time, I didn't let it. I faced the ghosts of my past and walked away, stronger than before. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Rachel, the other half of our betrayal story, reached out again. We hadn't talked much since that coffee shop meeting, but she sent me a message saying she was moving out of the neighborhood and wanted to meet up one last time. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave that chapter closed, but another part of me was curious. She was the only person who truly understood what I'd gone through, and maybe, just maybe, talking to her again would help me put the final nail in the coffin of my past. We met at a small park downtown, the kind with walking trails and benches overlooking the river. She looked better, lighter, like she'd finally found her footing again. "Hey," she greeted me with a small smile. "Thanks for meeting up." "Of course," I replied, sitting down beside her. "How've you been?" She sighed, looking out at the water. "Better. Moving feels like the last step, you know? Getting away from that neighborhood, from all the memories." I nodded. I knew exactly what she meant. "Yeah, I get that. It's hard to move on when you're surrounded by reminders." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts. Then, out of nowhere, she said something that stuck with me. "You know, Dan, we survived this. It doesn't feel like it sometimes, but we did. And that's something." She was right. We had survived. And not just survived, we'd come out stronger on the other side. We'd faced betrayal, heartbreak, and the complete shattering of our worlds, but we were still standing. Still moving forward. After that meeting, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. It wasn't about forgiving Kelly or forgetting what happened, it was about reclaiming my story, my life. The betrayal was a chapter, sure, but it wasn't the whole book. Life kept moving, and so did I. I started focusing more on work, picked up new hobbies, and even started dating again. Nothing serious, just getting back out there and seeing what the world had to offer. And with every step forward, I felt more like myself. Not the man defined by betrayal, but the man who overcame it. One night, as I sat on my balcony with Max at my feet, watching the city lights flicker below, I realized something important. Kelly's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just a painful detour that taught me more about resilience, trust, and the strength I didn't know I had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly freed. It's funny how life keeps moving even when you feel like you're stuck in place. After everything with Kelly and Mark, I figured the hardest part was behind me. But healing isn't just about moving on from the people who hurt you, it's about figuring out who you are without them. The new apartment had started to feel like home. The walls were bare at first, but little by little, I filled them with new memories, photos from hikes, art from local markets, and even some of my old photography that I'd tucked away when I was married. It felt good to reclaim parts of myself that I'd forgotten about. Max adapted quickly to the change. His routine was simple: morning walks through the park, evenings lounging on the couch, and the occasional trip to the dog-friendly coffee shop down the street. It's amazing how dogs just know when you need them. He stuck by my side through it all, like he understood that we were both navigating this new chapter together. But just as I started to feel like I had my footing, life threw me another curveball. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was heading home from work when my phone buzzed. It wasn't Kelly this time, it was Rachel. I hadn't heard from her since our last meeting at the park, and seeing her name pop up brought a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Hey Dan, hope you're doing okay. I know this is out of the blue, but there's something I think you should know. Can we meet?" My stomach dropped. What now? I thought I'd closed that chapter, locked it, and thrown away the key. But something in her message felt urgent, and I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it. We met at the same coffee shop as before, and when I walked in, I could tell by the look on her face that this wasn't just a casual check-in. "Hey," I greeted, sliding into the seat across from her. "What's going on?" She fidgeted with her cup, her eyes darting around the room like she was worried someone might overhear us. "It's about Kelly and Mark." I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "What about them?" She took a deep breath. "They're not together anymore." I blinked, trying to process that. "Okay, and?" She leaned in, lowering her voice. "It wasn't just Mark." For a second, I thought I misheard her. I stared at her, waiting for her to elaborate, but she just nodded like she was confirming the worst. "What do you mean?" I finally asked, my voice quieter now. Rachel sighed, rubbing her temples. "I found out after you and I met last time. Mark told me everything when things fell apart with Kelly. She was seeing other people too, not just him. There was some guy from her work, and," she hesitated, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. A neighbor from a few streets over. It wasn't just Mark, Dan. She was seeing multiple people. The words hit me like a freight train. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to wrap my head around what she'd just said. It wasn't just one betrayal, it was a series of them. The woman I thought I knew, the life I thought we shared, it had all been a lie on a scale I couldn't even comprehend. That I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. Wow. Just when I thought I couldn't be more surprised. Rachel gave me a sympathetic look. I'm sorry, Dan. I thought you deserved to know. I nodded, still processing. In a weird way, it almost made things easier. It wasn't just that she'd cheated with Mark, it was that she'd never been the person I thought she was. There was no fixing something that had been broken from the start. After Rachel left, I sat there for a long time, staring at my coffee, feeling the weight of everything settle over me like a thick fog. But instead of the anger I expected to feel, there was something else: relief. Because now I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that walking away had been the best decision of my life. That night, back in my apartment, I opened the box I'd shoved in the back of my closet, the one filled with old photos, notes, and souvenirs from my marriage. I looked at each item carefully, not with sadness, but with clarity. These things didn't hold power over me anymore. They were just remnants of a life that no longer belonged to me. I packed everything up and took it to the dumpster. It was time to let go for good. In the following weeks, I felt lighter. Free. I started focusing on things that brought me joy: weekend hikes with Max, photography sessions at sunrise, spontaneous road trips to places I'd never been. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. One evening, I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, when my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Kelly or Rachel. It was someone new, a woman I'd met at a photography class I signed up for on a whim. Her name was Emma, and we'd clicked immediately. She had a passion for life that was contagious, and being around her felt effortless. No baggage, no drama, just two people enjoying each other's company. Hey Dan, up for a coffee tomorrow? I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was the start of something new, something untarnished by the past. I replied, absolutely. Looking forward to it. And as I put my phone down and leaned back in my chair, I realized something profound. The past doesn't define you. The people who hurt you don't get to write your story. You do. And my story? It was just getting started. Meeting Emma felt like the first breath of fresh air after being underwater for too long. She was different, open, genuine, and completely unconnected to all the chaos I'd left behind. We met at a photography class I signed up for on a whim, and what started as casual conversations about cameras and lighting techniques quickly turned into something deeper. Our coffee meetups turned into weekend hikes, and soon enough, we were spending most of our free time together. There was no pressure, no awkwardness, and most importantly, no baggage. With Emma, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself or my past. She wasn't interested in digging into the details of what had happened with Kelly unless I wanted to talk about it, and I rarely did. It wasn't that I was avoiding it, but with Emma, it felt like I was finally living in the present, not the shadow of my past. One evening, as we sat at a cozy little cafe downtown, sipping coffee and watching the world go by, Emma looked at me with that curious glint in her eyes. Do you think you've really moved on from everything with Kelly? She asked gently, not prying, just curious. I stared into my cup for a moment, thinking about her question. It wasn't that I'd forgotten what happened, how could I? The betrayal still stung when I thought about it too long. But it didn't consume me anymore. It didn't define my every waking moment like it used to. I think I have, I finally said, meeting her gaze. It hurt like hell, but it taught me a lot. About what I want, what I deserve, and what I won't tolerate again. She smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Sounds like you're stronger because of it. I nodded, realizing she was right. I was stronger. The man sitting across from Emma wasn't the same guy who had walked out of that house with a suitcase full of shattered dreams. I had been broken, yes, but I'd put myself back together, piece by piece. After we left the cafe, we decided to take a walk through the city. The streets were alive with people, the hum of conversation and laughter filling the air. It felt good to be out, to feel connected to the world again. We ended up at a small park, the kind with string lights hanging from the trees and couples lounging on picnic blankets that we found an empty bench and sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. After a while, Emma broke the silence. You know, I don't think I've ever met someone who's come out of something like that with such a clear head, she said softly. That I chuckled, shaking my head. Trust me, it didn't feel clear for a long time. But I guess hitting rock bottom makes you realize what really matters. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet, steady kind of happiness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the kind of all-consuming love I thought I'd had with Kelly. It was something better. Something real. As we sat there, I realized something important. Kelly's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just a painful detour that led me to a better path. I'd spent so much time mourning the life I thought I'd lost, but the truth was, I hadn't lost anything worth keeping. I'd gained something far more valuable, a sense of self, a renewed trust in my own judgment, and the freedom to build a life that was truly mine. Eventually, we stood up to head back, and as we walked through the quiet streets, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past was behind me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was excited about what lay ahead. Not just because of Emma, but because I knew, deep down, that I was finally free from the weight of everything that had come before. When we reached my apartment, Emma turned to me, her eyes soft and full of something that felt like hope. So, where do we go from here? I smiled, feeling that same hope bloom inside me. Wherever we want. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Just when I thought I had finally closed the door on that chapter of my life, the past came knocking one last time. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and Emma and I were having breakfast on my balcony, watching the city wake up. The air was crisp, and for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt right. No lingering doubts, no shadows from the past, just the simple, quiet joy of being in the moment. That's when my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, expecting a work email or a reminder for something trivial. But instead, there it was, Kelly's name flashing on the screen like a ghost from a life I'd long since left behind. Emma noticed the shift in my expression. Everything okay? I hesitated, then shrugged. It's Kelly. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. That was one of the things I appreciated most about her. She never pushed me to share more than I was ready to. I stared at the screen for a few more seconds before finally opening the message. Hey Dan. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize how much I messed up. I hope you're doing okay. For a moment, I didn't feel anything. No anger, no sadness, just a strange sense of detachment. It was like reading a message from a stranger. The woman who sent that text wasn't the woman I'd married. That version of Kelly was long gone, and so was the version of me that had been devastated by her betrayal. Emma must have sensed my inner conflict because she reached over and placed her hand on mine. You don't have to respond, she said softly. Not if you don't want to. And she was right. I didn't owe Kelly anything. No closure, no forgiveness, no explanation. I'd already made peace with what had happened, and replying wouldn't change the past. But as I sat there, staring at the message, I realized something important. This wasn't about Kelly anymore. It was about me. About reclaiming my narrative and deciding how this chapter would truly end. So, I typed out a simple reply. I appreciate the apology. I hope you find what you're looking for. Take care. Short. Final. No room for more conversation. It was the closure I didn't even know I needed. After I hit send, I put my phone down and turned my attention back to Emma. She gave me a knowing smile, like she understood that this wasn't just a text, it was a turning point. Feel better, she asked that I nodded, feeling a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lift off my shoulders. Yeah. I really do. The rest of the day was a blur of simple joys, walking Max through the park, grabbing lunch at our favorite spot, and laughing over old photos from our recent hikes. It was the kind of day that reminded me how far I'd come. Not just from the pain and betrayal, but from the version of myself that had once believed his world had ended when his marriage did. As the sun set and we sat on the balcony, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me to this moment. The heartbreak, the anger, the nights spent questioning my worth, it had all been part of the journey. And while I wouldn't wish that pain on anyone, I knew it had shaped me into the person I was now. I'm proud of you, you know, Emma said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. I looked at her, surprised. For what? For not letting it define you, she replied. For moving forward when it would have been easier to stay stuck in the past. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. She was right. I hadn't just survived, I'd grown, evolved, and built a life that was better than anything I'd imagined. That night, as I lay in bed with Max curled up at my feet and Emma by my side, I realized something important. The story of my life wasn't about betrayal or loss. It was about resilience, growth, and finding happiness in the most unexpected places, and with that thought, I drifted off to sleep, knowing that the best chapters of my life were still waiting to be written.